Resolved, lock him up. I confess, Trump has been treated harshly by our country, me included. The media has castigated him, politicians on both sides of the aisle have expressed disdain for him. And even Tucker Carlson, the conservative media darling, bemoaned in the leaked text, "I hate him passionately." Referring to the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, Special Counsel John Durham concluded that the FBI acted with reckless political partisanship, that they were perhaps too eager to open an investigation into Trump and his team due to their political bias against him. And now, for the first time in U.S. history, a former president is facing not one, nor two, but 91 felony charges. Trump supporters across the country are upset, and understandably so. At cursory glance, it would seem obvious, almost self-evident, that the former president has not been treated, or has been treated harshly by the institutions of this country. But is harsh the same as unfair? Should Trump's treatment be truly that shocking? Is it actually unfair? Or is this just a convenient lie that Trump supporters tell themselves to cope with a historically corrupt leader? To be honest, not many things baffle me more than conservatives' confused indignation for Trump's treatment in this country. Does he have many enemies? Yes, of course, but didn't he come to Washington to make them? Was his explicit goal not to drain the swamp? Did he also not make an enemy out of his former personal attorneys, like Michael Cohen, his former campaign staff and managers, like Brad Parscale and Bill Stepien, his former government-appointed officials, like his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, even his own Attorney General, William Barr, former political allies like Jeff Sessions, Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, I'd list more, but I think we have a time limit on speeches here. Inside and outside of his administration that he alone deemed disloyal. How Trump even attacked Fox News for calling the Arizona race too quickly on election night, for daring to do their jobs. It's really surprising that a man who made so many enemies would find himself with so few friends. Aside from turning allies to enemies, Trump's also abused both his rhetoric as a candidate and his powers in office in ways that, while not always illegal, are certainly at least morally reprehensible. Was it any wonder that those in this country might have questioned Trump's allegiance to this country when he was on TV calling for Russia to release 30,000 emails from Hillary Clinton's servers? Does it give no pause that he did this while at the same time working with Roger Stone, who was coordinating email dumps from WikiLeaks that were obtained from the DNC servers by Russian hackers? Trump even pardoned Paul Manafort, became so connected to Russia that a Republican-led Senate Intel Committee considered him a grave threat and believed that Russia was intended to acquire information about Trump's campaign through him. And yes, in case you were wondering, this is the same Paul Manafort who was charged with defrauding the U.S. government, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. And yes, in case you were wondering, this was the very same Paul Manafort that Trump stuffed in to reward his loyalty with a presidential pardon before leaving office. Regardless of the personal feelings that we may have about Trump, and by we I mean me, I'm not here to talk about the ethics or lack thereof of Donald Trump, nor my personal dislike or hatred of Donald Trump. I'm here to argue the affirmative that he ought to be in prison. So, Trump's vicious violation of norms, his penchant for pardoning all those close to him, the felonious crimes aside, Trump's disdain for the rule of law and his criminal conduct as president are worthy of legal condemnation. While many are willing to support Trump's aggressive rhetoric on social media, I find that those who support him in his criminal cases only do so out of ignorance, deliberate or otherwise, of the facts of said cases. So let's review some of those facts. The first matter is a simple one, federal classified documents case of Mar-a-Lago. In March of 2021, NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, requested from the Donald that he return boxes and boxes of potentially classified material that he had personally overseen removed from the White House and stored in his resort at Mar-a-Lago. Trump repeatedly refused these requests and only returned 15 of the requested boxes almost a year later in January after repeated badgering from NARA. These were not all the boxes with classified materials that Trump had taken with him, only a few boxes that Trump had his employee, Walt Nauta, go through first to see what he felt like sending back. After NARA discovered classified material in said boxes on February 9th of 2022, the case was referred to the DOJ, leading the FBI to open an investigation in March. Donald Trump stored this material, knowing it was classified, and knowing that Mar-a-Lago was not a storage facility for said information. Some of the information that Trump retained were national defense secrets, and a club that was accessed by tens of thousands of members and guests in the duration of its storage. He did this despite repeated requests to return it, and once he realized that federal agencies were looking for it, he instructed multiple employees and legal counsel to move around and hide the boxes in order to obscure what material he still possessed, all while lying to investigators about said classified material. He also stands accused of showing off some of this classified material to reporters and journalists who come by for interviews, with 2 cases being mentioned directly in the indictments. In one of these instances, there exists an audio recording of Donald Trump meeting with an interview team, none of whom possessed any security clearances. Trump braggadociously showed some of the documents off, describing a plan of attack that he claimed was prepared for him by the Department of Defense and a senior military official, most likely to exonerate him in the eyes of the journalists of the claims of being a war hawk. Trump himself told the individuals that the plan was highly confidential and, quote, secret, end quote. He also mentioned that, quote, as president, he couldn't declassify it, end quote, and now, quote, that he can't, but it's still secret, end quote. Under 18 U.S.C. 793, the willful retention of national defense information is a crime. Of this, Trump is guilty. Under 18 U.S.C. 15, deliberate obstruction of any federal investigation is also a crime. Trump's orders to his employees to hide information from his own lawyers or federal investigators is a deliberate obstruction of said investigators' investigation. Of this, Trump is also guilty. But in the election fraud case, 18 U.S.C. 371 speaks of 2 or more people conspiring either to commit any offense against the United States or to defraud the United States, and 18 U.S.C. 241 makes it unlawful for 2 or more people to agree to injure, threaten, or intimidate a person in the United States in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured by the Constitution or laws of the United States. Did Trump conspire against our rights as Americans to have our votes counted? Well, let's be clear about what needs to be proven and what doesn't for this particular federal case. Many claim that as long as Trump truly believed election fraud at a level that was outcome determinative, he was within his right to do so, commit literally any act that he wanted to. Fortunately, this is not how the criminal works. Conviction with no adherence to rule of law is simply vigilantism. Many people also speak of intent, but intent is not really an issue in the case that Jack Smith has brought to federal prosecutors or federal court, or rather, not the intent of whether or not he believes that the election was stolen. Take, for example, the false elector plot that Trump and his cronies concocted. Donald Trump and his team had 7 different groups of citizens, 7 different states affirm that they were in fact the duly appointed electors, authorized to transmit their state's electoral college vote through NARA to Congress. This was a lie. They were not appointed by the state assemblies. They did not meet in the state capitals. And surely, they were not authorized to transmit those electoral votes under false pretenses to Congress to be counted on January 6th. Trump's intent only matters insofar as he compelled these citizens to gather and lie about being the duly appointed state electors. They were not. Trump and his team compelled them to lie. Maybe that Donald Trump rightfully thought that he won the election, and that he thought there was corruption that the state assembly hadn't had the time to thoroughly investigate it. Even if that were the case, it is not lawful for Trump and his team to compel others to lie about being state electors in the hope that their electoral votes will be counted as opposed to the legally certified electors. This is fraud. Same is true of the infamous call he placed in Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger, encouraging him to find 11,000 votes to help him flip the state. Even if he did not believe that there was election fraud, they gave him no right to call any election officials or state assemblies to pressure them to change the outcome of their elections. And what of 18 U.S.C. 1512? Do we believe that Trump attempted to corruptly obstruct an official proceeding? Well, we know he did. We know that Trump attempted to bully his own vice president into accepting the fraudulent elector slates, knowing that they were sent under false pretenses. He did this on Twitter the day of January 6th. This happened multiple times in the days and weeks preceding January 6th. When rebuffed on a phone call on Christmas, Trump even seemed to admit to Pence that he knew he was being deceitful, admitting to him that Pence was perhaps too honest, quote unquote, for refusing his plot. Again, even if Trump had thought that there was outcome determinative election fraud, this was clearly not the legally acceptable avenue to address that grievance. Assuming that even half the accusations laid out in the indictments against Donald Trump are true, certainly he should be convicted of the aforementioned crimes, many of which carry with them heavy prison sentences. Donald Trump acts as though he lives above the law, as though the Constitution and the American government exists not just beneath him, but at his whim and pleasure, only necessary when convenient to him, and cast aside when it hampers his ambitions. It's important to send a message not just to Trump, nor those that support him, but to all future presidents and their supporters, that this sort of injustice will not be tolerated. As Americans, we should not accept the armor of ex-president be protected against this sort of justice. Or, said in more simple words, lock him up.
It's for the guest. Yes. Mr. Rabin.
So, I'm very well on it. And I'm about like a concept that has existed throughout all of legal history of tolerated illegality. There's like some level of illicit activity that has always been avoided being prosecuted by virtue of executive discretion. I'd just like to look at that conversation with this.
What? Well, can you give me? Wait a minute. I'll ask a question.
Perhaps clarification.
Clarification. What crimes were committed by prior presidents, and what criminal statutes are we referring to?
Well, there have been many crimes that have been committed while people were presidents. So some actually killed people, some
Like personally?
yeah, of course. And also the president who had notorious corruption scandals that were ultimately not incarcerated and simply impeached. Nixon.
Wasn't he pardoned by Ford though? Doesn't the pardon kind of imply that he was going to be criminally charged?
I'm simply asking guests, like, how would you put this in conversation with this notion of law? Why is executive discretion distinct here? Why not pardon President Trump?
Why not pardon President Trump? I feel like there might be a time and a place for when pardons are necessary for the healing of some political process. So for instance, if Nixon was indeed impeached by both halves of Congress, and if there was probably nothing further to be gained by federally prosecuting him for his involvement in Watergate, perhaps you could see an argument there for impeachment. However, Donald Trump is running for office again, which I think is important to consider. And Donald Trump failed to be impeached in the Senate because the Senate believed, for a lot of them, that they didn't have the constitutional statutory grounds to actually impeach him because he'd already left office. So I don't like that the supporters of Trump seem to inhabit both worlds where he couldn't be impeached because he was already out of office for January 6th in the Senate, but now that he's out of office, he can't be held criminally or civilly liable because he's president. I don't think he's both those.
Questions from the guest? Mr. Lindbergh?
Yeah, I'm similar in this vein to this question. I mean, what happens with when the next Republican president comes to town, or the next Republican governor, the next Republican DA decides that Barack Obama should be tried for war crimes, and a Florida jury makes him right? To what extent this is precedent of political how much of this is rule of law and how much of this is political persecution, and how do we stop future political persecution?
So I find that in matters of law, I think that looking at the actual law, I think is really important to determine how somebody should be held accountable for a particular thing. I would say that how should future, presidents or governors ever act? I mean, I would say they probably shouldn't break the law. Kind of points to the idea that what if these people are tried for war crimes? The question doesn't really make sense though. It's the International Criminal Court, the ICC, that tries people for war crimes, and we don't even spend ourselves in the jurisdiction of the ICC, and the idea that you wouldn't take trying to make war crimes, again, you would have to point to a federal statute, I think you'd have to point to a particular crime done, and then you have to say, should there be a prosecution for said crime? I know that there's a lot of people that don't like actions that presidents take. So for instance, people are critical of Obama, and drone strikes of American citizens, and people will be upset about that. But the question is there an actual federal crime you can point to that's been broken? And oftentimes I feel like there's not.
They're related.
So Abraham Lincoln, for example, suspended the writs of habeas corpus. He broke the law. You can argue that he used executive power, but he broke the law. If Andrew Johnson decided that, I'm going to make the Attorney General prosecute Abraham Lincoln on the basis of writs of habeas corpus, should Andrew Johnson be able to do that?
I'm not familiar with every single thing that was done during the Civil War, but my understanding is that most of it was eventually signed off on by the Supreme Court, no? Like, I remember there was a really big Supreme Court case, was the, I think it was called Price cases, where the question of whether Abraham Lincoln could kind of like embargo or hold up ships and prevent them from, docking in southern states was a big Supreme Court question. They found that he did have the authority to prevent that from happening. I don't know particularly in regards to suspending habeas corpus, or what the ruling on that was. My understanding is most of what he did in that time period was eventually deemed constitutionally allowed. But I think it could be wrong on that. I don't think I am, but I could be.
Any other questions? Yes, Ms. McStone.
Oh, wait, also, hold on, also, wait, I'm sorry, perfect. But whether a president does or does something that he also something according to too, I don't know if that's necessarily a criminal offense as well. That might just be something that, like, if a president doesn't do it, like,
I want to try to nail down our exact motivations for locking him up, because you mentioned that Donald Trump is running for president again and wasn't to meet the that's relevant, and I think that's very true. But I think that sort of implies the question that is our motivation just trying to disqualify Trump from running for office, or are we going for some sort of punitive measures? And if our goal is just to disqualify him from the race, then should we be trying to do something else other than like federal prosecution?
I mean, I think the goal is to hold him accountable for the crimes he committed. I think the goal. When we talk about somebody like running for president again or not, I think that the idea, the main focus there was, should he have been pardoned? Now, the question of should you pardon somebody or not is, in my opinion, is largely a political question. But whether or not somebody should be held accountable, I mean, Nixon was impeached in both Houses of Congress, and Donald Trump wasn't, specifically because people said that, well, he's already out of office, so we can't hold him accountable here. If you want to hold him accountable, it has to be done in a criminal or civil court. Now he's being held accountable in criminal or civil court, and now people are like, well, you needed to impeach him. I guess, like, you need to time travel and do it. So, yeah, I think that the route that they're going right now, I think holding somebody accountable for, like, and not even like edge case crimes, but like pretty blatant crimes that were committed in ways that historically have like never been done before, or at least in the past 150 or so years, never been done before. Yeah, I think he's earned it.
Former President.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think right now I largely agree with the guest speaker, but I'm curious on how kind of brutal pragmatism plays into this. I agree that it might be the right thing, but 40, 45, 50% of the country really back this guy. And I'm kind of worried what will happen lock him up. What does that have the country do? I'm from Covington, Georgia. We had people at the Capitol riot, or the insurrection. So, is there a pragmatic argument here that maybe hold off and do this later so the country doesn't split apart?
I think the important thing is for 40 to 50% of the country to realize that they want to support a convicted felon as president. I think that's more important than whatever pragmatic gains we think we're accomplishing by not going the prosecution route. I'm somewhat sympathetic towards the pragmatic arguments, but I think the pragmatic arguments only last for about 30 seconds before you think a little bit more and you're like, okay, well, if we're thinking pragmatism, is it really a good standard to set that a president can basically convict whatever, or commit whatever crime that he wants, and will always expect him to be never held accountable as soon as he's out of office? I would argue that pragmatic concern, which is why we have a criminal justice system, right, is to hold people accountable for crimes, ideally so they don't commit them in the future. I think that pragmatic concern outweighs the immediate concern of, well, what if we, lock Trump up now and a lot of people support him? I do agree that that doesn't look good for a variety of reasons, but I think that we're missing what the actual problem is. I don't think the problem is that 40 to 50% of the country is going to be really unhappy if Trump gets convicted. I think the problem is that 40 to 50% of the country supports Trump in his crimes.
From all.